Roxalyn Bellion was once a ruthless villainess, a woman who had personally plunged the entire world into chaos and misery. People even whispered that she was an irresistible temptress who had survived by devouring and stealing the life of her own fiancé. She was the sinful daughter cast out and shunned by the entire Bellion family after throwing away even the most sacred bonds of kinship to stand proudly in a pool of her enemy's blood. As she sat imprisoned in the cold dungeon, an authoritative voice drifted down from above, mockingly remarking that those terrifying titles were exactly what the world had always called her. The man outside the bars let out a contemptuous laugh, sneering that titles like villainess or witch were nothing but a ridiculous joke now, because she was currently just an ugly, powerless prisoner wasting away while waiting for the executioner's block. He roughly grabbed the hem of Roxalyn's white clothing and barked her name with open contempt. The man's arrogant, pathetic nature showed plainly as he shouted that when he had been gracious enough to offer to marry her, she should have known her place and bowed her head in gratitude. The narration rattled off the grave crimes pinned on her, from the attempted murder of the third prince, mass murder, and fraud to public indecency, leaving her with an irrevocable death sentence. Though she knew most of those crimes had been fabricated by others and dumped on her, she thought it no longer mattered, then calmly gave a small cough and asked who the man in front of her even was. Baron Gilbert, perhaps. Roxalyn slowly raised her head and coldly told him to take a good look, because she had lost one eye and could no longer see everything around her clearly. Deep down, she realized with contempt that she truly could not remember the face of that filthy pig who used to prey on girls young enough to be his daughters, making the man before her freeze in fury. Stung by the insult, the man flew into such a rage that the hand gripping his sword trembled as he ground his teeth and cursed her as a worthless bitch. He violently drew his sword and roared that he was Baron Robert, demanding to know how a lowly prisoner like her dared mock him in front of everyone. He pressed the cold, sharp blade directly against her throat and shouted whether she had a death wish, while she merely wondered whose hands would ultimately claim her life. She reasoned that the crown prince, soon to inherit the throne, currently held her life in his hands and would surely parade the infamous villainess before the public before executing her to strengthen his authority and win the people's support. Roxalyn bitterly wondered whether she really would be used as a pawn until her final breath, and then die according to someone else's wishes. But she immediately rejected that grim fate, thinking that if the insecure fool in front of her lost control and killed a notorious criminal like her, he would be the one taking her place on the executioner's block. She casually mocked Robert, saying he simply was not her type because she had a weak stomach and could not stand the sight of foul-smelling omnivorous pigs. She firmly declared that she would be the one to end this farce with her own hands and in her own way, as punishment for the dregs of society. Robert was stunned, speechless for a moment, before exploding, roaring that she was a filthy little bitch. He swung his sword wildly toward her head, screaming for her to die and pay for the insult she had just thrown at him. But the blade suddenly stopped halfway when a deep, commanding voice ordered him to halt, startling Robert. The sword slipped from Robert's hand and clattered onto the cold stone floor, leaving the young lady still sitting calmly on the ground without the slightest tremor of fear. Robert spun around in shock and stammered, asking why the other man had suddenly appeared in this dark, damp place. The elegant Marquise Jeroen appeared and shattered the tense atmosphere, leaving Robert able to do nothing but call his name in a frightened tremble. Jeroen leisurely walked over and coolly exposed the truth. Robert still had not realized that the young lady was merely using him to end her own life, making her expression shift slightly because he had seen straight through her. He planted his foot on the blood-stained blade on the floor and coldly warned Robert that if he dared kill her, Robert himself would be the next one sent to the executioner's block. A dangerous purple gleam flashed in Jeroen's eyes as he asked whether Robert truly wanted to suffer that consequence, making the Baron frantically wave his hands and deny it in terror. Robert let out a horrified scream and bolted from the freezing dungeon as if he had just encountered a real demon. Roxalyn let out a quiet breath of relief, then looked coldly up at the man before her and asked what had brought Garen Wilbrid all the way here. Jeroen smiled faintly and wished her a good afternoon, casually teasing that her beautiful face looked far more battered and miserable than the last time they had met. She bluntly brushed aside the small talk, saying she was in no mood to chat, especially with the man who had mercilessly thrown her in prison and crushed her last chance to escape, then coldly asked whether he had come to pity her or mock her. Jeroen denied it with a light laugh, saying he had only come because he wanted to offer her a new opportunity, while lamenting that this world was terribly dull and every bit of entertainment ended far too quickly. She immediately rose to her feet and called out his double game, asking whether he had pretended to be her protector all this time just to keep the fun from ending and lull her into lowering her guard, only to point a sword at her himself and throw her into this dungeon in the end. The narration slipped into her memories, recalling that before she was dragged here, life on the run after being branded a traitor by countless fabricated accusations had been nothing but endless exhaustion and misery. Back then, Jeroen had been the only one who reached out to help her, leaving her no choice but to trust him and let him act as her protector by providing her a place to hide. So when she realized he had intended to betray her from the very beginning, the shock had been unbearable, until she suddenly froze when Garen chuckled and asked whether she believed in the existence of parallel worlds. The idea of a parallel world appeared like something out of a fantasy, opening the door to a mysterious new reality before the young lady. The narration explained that every choice a person made created countless branching paths that split the world into different realities, and that the first person to propose such a heretical theory had been burned alive at the stake, while every book on the subject was banned. Roxalyn coldly asked whether he had really come all this way just to tell her such ridiculous nonsense, making him smile bitterly and complain that her constant cruelty was breaking his heart. Watching her painfully cough up blood, he urged her to think about it, because even she surely had regrets, and moments when she wished she had made a different choice in life. He gently lifted her chin, thinking that even he would find it a terrible waste for her to die, with no legacy beyond the label of a vicious villainess. Garen looked straight into her eyes and earnestly asked whether she truly wanted to keep living, his lifelong rival. Roxalyn let out a dry little laugh, even as bright red blood streamed from the corner of her mouth. A violent coughing fit seized her and doubled her over in pain, making Garen's expression suddenly change in alarm. Garen wondered in shock when her condition had become this critical. He mentally reviewed the wound from earlier and was certain that Slash could not possibly have been severe enough to make her keep coughing up blood like this. Seeing the old fox finally look confused, she smiled faintly and teased that she had hidden it so well, even someone as meticulous as him had failed to notice, then asked whether this was not an incredibly thrilling and surprising sight. She casually revealed that she had deliberately taken a poison called hemocruoris before she was captured, a vicious toxin that prevented blood from clotting and caused it to keep pouring out of the body. She giggled smugly, pleased to discover that there were still things in this world beyond his control, and declared that in the end, she was the one who had won this deadly game. Looking at the pool of blood spreading across the floor, she weakly confessed that she had actually been terribly lonely, and admitted that she had truly been happy during the brief months she spent by his side. Watching dawn begin to glow through the gap in the dungeon door, she repeated his question about whether she wanted to live, and declared that her answer was a firm no that extinguished every last hope of saving her, accompanied by the final peaceful smile of the villainess's life. Garen stood frozen, watching her body slowly grow cold before him in utter devastation. Her body collapsed onto the cold earthen floor, marking the end of a tragic life filled with bitterness and resentment. A panicked guard announced that she had completely stopped breathing, just as eerie blue flames suddenly erupted and engulfed the entire space. Garen stood tall amid the green flames and chuckled, remarking that she always knew how to surprise him right up to the very last second. A sinister smile curled across his lips as he promised that the two of them would surely meet again soon in another reality, his stubborn rival. The narration captured Roxalin's final thoughts as she quietly breathed a sigh of relief, grateful that the exhausting days of fleeing and the suffocating dungeon had finally come to an end, allowing her at last to rest in peace. But then the murmur of a nearby crowd suddenly reached her ears, people asking what had happened and whether she had really jumped from up there, rudely disturbing her eternal sleep. Whispers kept circling around her, people clicking their tongues and saying she must have lost her mind, making her irritably wonder why everything around her was so loud and headache-inducing. She thought in confusion that she was supposed to be dead, so where were all these chaotic sounds coming from? Roxalin jolted, opened her eyes wide, and gasped, stunned to realize she had just awakened from a long dream. The young lady shot upright in bed, shocking the servants gathered around her. A delighted maid shouted to Madame that the young lady had finally awakened from her deep coma. Madame Carmel strode over and harshly asked what crazy stunt she planned to pull this time, scolding her for causing non-stop trouble for the family every time she woke up. Hearing that painfully familiar shrill voice, Roxalin startled and wondered in alarm whether the person before her was really that stubborn woman Carmel. Staring at the flesh-and-blood woman standing right in front of her, she was stunned to wonder how this person could possibly be here. She furiously remembered that Carmel was her father's second wife, the woman who had mercilessly destroyed her family with her own hands and torn them apart in her previous life. A bloody memory resurfaced as she clearly recalled stabbing this woman to death herself in revenge, thinking she should have finished her off even sooner. But when she looked down at her pale, scarless hands, then checked her body and even the eye that had once been ruined, only to find everything perfectly intact, she realized something was terribly wrong. Realizing this was her old bedroom in the Duke's estate, a place that should have been completely destroyed in the fires of war in her previous life, she stared blankly ahead, not even bothering to respond as Carmel shouted at her and demanded to know whether she was listening. Carmel sighed in exasperation and complained that Roxalin was the most troublesome, overly dramatic child she had ever seen, to the point that Carmel herself felt embarrassed for her. When Carmel demanded whether her deliberate suicide attempt still had not been enough to satisfy her, Roxalin was stunned to wonder why everyone thought she had tried to kill herself. She rejected the idea of such a cowardly suicide, because by nature she would rather take up a sword and fight to the end, while realizing that although everyone was calling her by the right name, the Roxalin they described sounded like a complete stranger. She pieced together the strange clues. People who should have been dead were alive and well, a mansion that had fallen was standing intact again, and everyone remembered her as a completely different, timid person, until Gerun's question about the existence of parallel worlds suddenly echoed in her mind as the only possible answer. Grinding her teeth and cursing inwardly, she furiously realized that bastard Gerun had not been lying after all, and that absurd parallel world truly existed. Seeing her remain silent, Carmel angrily demanded whether Roxalin was deliberately ignoring her and insisted she was only saying these things for her own good, making Roxalin irritably warn that she was being far too noisy and only making her pounding headache worse. Caught completely off guard by her stepdaughter's sudden sharp resistance, the stepmother froze for several seconds and stammered in utter disbelief. Roxalin indifferently apologized for the fact that Carmel kept buzzing in her ear like an unbearably annoying mosquito, then bluntly told her to get out of the room if she intended to keep nagging. Carmel could hardly believe her ears, inwardly panicking as she realized something was seriously wrong with the stepdaughter who had always been so timid. She wondered in confusion how the Roxalin, who had once been too shy to speak, had suddenly become so arrogant and stubborn, behaving as if she had turned into a completely different person. Carmel flew into a rage and shouted, demanding how Roxalin dared use such an insolent tone with her own stepmother. Looking at Roxalin's sparse jewelry, she assumed the girl must simply be putting on an act of modesty and humility ahead of her upcoming royal wedding. Roxalyn coldly exposed the flaw in her claim by reminding Carmel that she was only her future stepmother and had not even officially married into the Bellion family yet, leaving Carmel speechless with shock. She stepped closer and firmly declared that she did not care whether Carmel married into the family or not, but from now on, the woman had better know her place and stop bothering her. Leaning close to Carmel's ear, she whispered threateningly that if Carmel had the sense to disappear, Roxalyn would turn a blind eye to her planting spies to steal the family's secrets, or slowly poisoning her father to death in this lifetime. Carmel's face drained of all color as she trembled, wondering how a timid little girl could possibly know every detail of her sinister plan. Seeing her mistress threatened, the maid beside Carmel immediately raised her voice in defense and scolded Roxalyn for going too far by disrespecting the new lady of the house. Without warning, Roxalyn grabbed the maid by the hair and yanked her down to the floor, making the girl scream in pain and shock. Holding the kneeling maid's head firmly beneath her, Roxalyn coldly corrected her, "Madame Carmel, not the new lady of the house," and firmly declared that she was the young lady of this estate, so a lowly servant had no right to lecture her. The maid sobbed and begged someone to save her because it hurt so badly, while Roxalyn merely sighed in annoyance at all the irritating noise. Carmel frantically shouted to ask what kind of madness Roxalyn was pulling, and Roxalyn calmly pointed at the maid groaning on the floor. She slowly lifted the maid's face and said it seemed the girl still had not understood the message of "Don't bother me" that Roxalyn had just delivered to her mistress. Seeing the maid's trembling, hateful glare, Roxalyn tightened her grip on the girl's jaw in warning, leaving her in too much pain to speak. Roxalyn flashed a bright yet wicked smile and declared in a steely voice that what she meant was this: anyone who dared stand in her way, she was perfectly willing to drag straight down to hell with her, then coldly ordered both of them out of her room immediately. She effortlessly pinned the pitiful maid to the floor, leaving Carmel standing nearby with wide eyes, utterly terrified by the reborn villainess's ruthless aura. Her declaration that she would drag everyone down to hell echoed throughout the room, leaving the wicked stepmother frozen and trembling as she realized she had just angered a real demon. The maid lay sprawled on the floor, sobbing and begging Lady Roxalyn to spare her life while admitting she was at fault. In response to the maid's panic, Roxalyn merely curled her lips into a cold, contemptuous smile. She casually ordered her stepmother to take this foolish servant who resembled her mistress and get out of her room at once, leaving Carmel stunned and speechless. Though she tried to restrain herself, Carmel angrily warned that even if she could sympathize with the shock of Roxalyn's failed suicide attempt, she would never overlook what had happened today. With that, she coldly told Roxalyn to reflect on her behavior before turning on her heel and leaving, abandoning the maid who cried and begged to be allowed to follow. Relieved to have cleared out the nuisance in front of her, Roxalyn thought that her next task was to gather information and determine whether this truly was a parallel world. Looking through her belongings, she sighed when she realized there was only one elegant black dress with purple floral patterns that actually fit her body. Seeing that every other outfit was old and torn, she immediately guessed this had to be another dirty trick arranged by her stepmother Carmel to mistreat her. As she applied elegant red lipstick, she silently declared that today would be the last day she tolerated that woman's arrogance and abuse. Looking into the mirror, the young lady felt dissatisfied to see that no matter how much makeup she wore, she still looked sickly and pale. She thought this body was in even worse condition than when she had been 17 in her previous life, and although she was not fully satisfied with the outfit, it was already time, so she had no choice but to leave. The narration revealed the conclusion she had painstakingly reached after 3 days of quietly gathering information from every corner around her. She confirmed that she had truly been reborn into a parallel world 10 years before the time of her death, and that her current body was only 17 years old. In this reality, the same people and major events were largely playing out just as they had in her previous life, but there were still a few small differences between the two worlds. Most notably, her circumstances here were far more miserable. Despite being known as the Duke's only daughter, she had been provided nothing but cheap, old clothes and worn-out jewelry. Hearing the maids openly gather and whisper that she was gloomy, she inwardly compared it to her previous life, when everyone trembled before her brutality, and wondered how such a pathetic version of herself could possibly exist. Still, she comforted herself that this life of being shunned was 1,000 times better than her days as a fugitive, hunted and rejected by the world. So she decided that her greatest goal in this lifetime would be to live a peaceful, easy, perfectly ordinary life at all costs, just like everyone else. To achieve that, she calculated that the first thing she needed to do was eliminate her stepmother Carmel and prevent the Bellion family's destruction, but she suddenly stopped when she opened the door. The man standing outside jumped in fright and stammered out the young lady's name in surprise. Seeing his exaggerated reaction, she calmly asked why he was so shocked when her name was on the guest list for the family gathering as well, leaving the man too flustered to answer. The man was secretly astonished by her unusually dazzling appearance, which had nearly made him fail to recognize her, and wondered how such a gloomy girl could transform so dramatically overnight. Ignoring his confusion, she firmly ordered him to open the dining room doors, where the lively voices of conversation could be heard from inside. The moment the doors cracked open, the entire dining room fell deathly silent, and every eye turned toward the newcomer. Roxalyn politely greeted everyone first, startling her grandfather, Duke Devon Bellion, who sat at the head of the table. Her gaze swept over her grandfather and her uncle Aegis Bellion, while the red-haired uncle holding a fork froze and called her name uncertainly. Her stepmother Carmel made no effort to hide her anger and loudly demanded how Roxalyn dared show her face in such a dignified place. Finally, Roxalyn glanced at her biological father, Cherty Bellion, who sat silently with his usual expressionless face. Looking at those familiar faces, she was overcome with emotion as she remembered that the Bellion family had collapsed in her previous life, and all of them had died 5 years before her own death, making her believe she would never see them again. She felt a small spark of happiness to see them alive and well, thinking that although she had originally planned to announce her departure today, staying a few more days just to look at them might not be such a bad idea. Carmel immediately shot to her feet and shouted, scolding Roxalyn for daring to wear such revealing, disrespectful clothing in front of her elders. The woman continued berating her, calling a dress that exposed her arms indecent, and lecturing her on a lady's proper etiquette, making Roxalyn let out a faint, mocking laugh. She casually offered a blatantly insincere apology and asked what exactly Carmel meant, inwardly laughing at the wicked stepmother's useless attempt to seize control of the situation. She boldly exposed Carmel's filthy past, bluntly bringing up how she had once poisoned her former husband and framed a young count to seize power, declaring that someone as vile as her had no right to lecture Roxalyn about anything. With a radiant, almost bewitching smile, she drove the knife in deeper by emphasizing that she had been the Duke's daughter for all 17 years of her life, unlike a commoner like Carmel who survived by clinging to the skirts of nobility. Determined not to let Carmel run wild and destroy the family again, Roxalyn indifferently watched her stepmother loudly cry and complain to Devon and Cherty about being humiliated. But Carmel's performance was met only by Devon Bellion's cold, authoritative order for everyone to shut their mouths and focus on eating. Seeing that her grandfather was still as domineering as he had been in her previous life, Roxalyn inwardly marveled, while Carmel continued whispering grievances into Cherty's ear beside her. As the meal began, Roxalyn suddenly froze when she sensed something deeply wrong hidden in the food on her plate. Behind her, the servants had gathered together, covering their mouths and snickering slyly, as though waiting for some entertaining scene to unfold. Instead, Roxalyn suddenly flashed a dazzlingly charming smile and declared that today's food was truly delicious. She calmly cut off a piece and held it out, offering to share this very special dish with everyone, making the servants jump in terror. She cheerfully asked whether her father and uncle would like to taste the maid's cooking, leaving Uncle Aegis slightly surprised by the sudden invitation. Easygoing by nature, her uncle happily accepted, believing this was the first rare request his young niece had ever made of him. Carmel panicked and loudly tried to stop him, telling Aegis not to indulge Roxalin's stubbornness, which made Roxalin raise an eyebrow at the unusually familiar way she addressed him. Watching her uncle brightly ask for confirmation, Roxalin awkwardly nodded yes, and inwardly marveled at how unexpectedly warm and gentle this man was with his family. As her uncle leaned closer to taste the food, she thought he was an incredibly interesting person, with an aura that seemed to change dramatically with every facial expression. The narration explained that although he appeared carefree and playful on the surface, when disaster struck the family and its pillars were lost, he alone stepped forward to shoulder the heaviest responsibilities. That strong-willed uncle had swallowed his pride and endured humiliation to protect the Bellion family's honor until the very end, driven by an iron sense of responsibility. Yet despite all those extraordinary efforts, the Bellion family in her previous life still could not escape its catastrophic downfall, leaving her quietly saddened. After tasting the dish, Aegis praised it enthusiastically, as genuinely delicious, and suggested that his father and younger brother Cherti should try a bite too. The stubborn uncle eagerly fed some to Cherti, then turned to use his special privilege of asking for a favor to force his father Devon to taste it as well. Grandfather Devon grumbled irritably about his son's pestering, but ultimately had no choice but to open his mouth and swallow the piece of meat. The moment he finished chewing, however, the Duke's expression changed, and he nearly choked, fury surging inside him as he realized someone had dared pull such a filthy trick right at his own dining table. Veins bulged across the Duke's forehead as he exploded in rage and roared with murderous menace, demanding to know which bastard had grown tired of living and dared try to poison someone. The young lady calmly urged her grandfather not to get too angry, then indifferently pointed straight at the trembling maids as the culprits. At her firm accusation, Devon immediately ordered them thrown out, ignoring the maids as they wailed that it was all a misunderstanding. The terrified maids turned to Carmel and begged her to save them, but the wicked woman merely froze and pretended not to see them in order to protect herself. As the Duke cursed the vermin who had dared cause trouble, Carmel hurriedly bowed and apologized to her father-in-law, shifting all the blame onto the maids by claiming they had acted on their own out of blind loyalty to her. Roxalin lightly tapped her dinner knife against the table and smiled meaningfully, sarcastically remarking that such devoted training sounded exactly like the notorious criminal organization Makluxa. At the mention of that forbidden name, Carmel jolted in alarm and awkwardly asked whether Roxalin was referring to that dangerous criminal syndicate. The narration introduced Makluxa, an infamous underground organization whose operations and ranks were structured around chess pieces. In her previous life, they had originally been timid figures hiding in the shadows and waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But after secretly infiltrating the Bellion family and planting spies within it, the organization's size and influence suddenly expanded at a terrifying rate. Through despicable tactics, such as stealing confidential information and poaching clients, they personally drove countless noble families into financial ruin. Her thoughts returned to the fanatical loyalty of those who had been trained from childhood within this criminal organization. The young lady's probing gaze and suggestive question continued drilling into Carmel's already panicked mind. Her forceful accusation rang through the dining room once again, declaring that her stepmother's true identity was that of a high-ranking infiltrator. As proof, she calmly pointed to the decisive evidence, a special mark engraved beneath Carmel's heel, visible only at a certain temperature, so members of the organization could recognize one another. Carmel froze in shock, sweat pouring down her face as she wondered how a mere little girl could possibly know such a top-secret detail of the organization. Realizing the situation had become extremely dangerous, the wicked woman ground her teeth and decided she would have to resort to violence as a final measure to clean up this mess. Carmel turned and grabbed Shirty's arm, crying theatrically as she swore that she had only ever loved him sincerely and begged him not to believe those baseless accusations. When her husband remained silent despite her desperate pleas, Carmel urged him frantically until Chirty could only let out a weak sound of pain. With a dark expression, Chirty awkwardly suggested taking Carmel back to her room while he investigated the truth himself, making Aegis shake his head in exasperation at his younger brother's weakness. Noticing the red marks and severe pain in her father's chest, the sharp-eyed Roxalyn narrowed her eyes and realized Carmel was secretly using sinister hypnosis on him. She casually added one crucial detail to warn her father. Makluxa spies were always highly skilled in concealed weapons and hypnosis. Her firm warning left both Chirty and Carmel frozen in shock for several seconds, overwhelmed by fear. Inside Chirty's mind, the hypnotic commands that had forced him all this time to remain loyal to Carmel and protect her suddenly echoed painfully once more. He was horrified to realize that he had been psychologically manipulated so brutally that he had been willing to betray and hurt his own blood relatives. With the truth exposed, he blamed himself for being foolish enough not to notice anything strange all this time. Seeing Chirty begin to doubt her, Carmel panicked and realized the situation was out of control, leaving her only one option: eliminate Lady Roxalyn immediately, right here. The wicked woman softened her voice and pretended to calm Roxalyn down, suggesting she stop this harmful joke because the whole thing was merely a misunderstanding. As she stepped closer in a soothing manner, she secretly pulled a poisoned acupuncture needle from her sleeve, planning to stab Roxalyn in the neck the moment her guard dropped and silence her forever. But Roxalyn moved first, ordering the butler to restrain her wicked stepmother's wrist immediately. The butler locked Carmel's arm down in an instant, making her scream in pain as the poisoned needle clattered onto the cold stone floor. The sharp, poisoned needle glittered under the light, like undeniable proof of the woman's failed assassination attempt. Seeing the poisoned needle fall, the surrounding maids burst into fearful whispers, realizing the young lady had been telling the truth and that Carmel was indeed a cold-blooded murderer. Ignoring every attempt at explanation, Duke Devon Bellion erupted in fury and ordered the soldiers to drag that venomous woman straight to the execution grounds. While Carmel screamed wildly and begged Chirty to save her, the young lady merely smiled and calmly waved a cold farewell to her opponent. Cornered, Carmel whipped around and cursed Roxalyn through clenched teeth as an insolent brat, furious that she had been careless enough to let the girl discover her weakness. When she screamed madly and demanded to know how Roxalyn knew so much about the organization's internal secrets, Roxalyn simply sipped her wine and mocked Carmel for finally taking off her fake mask of gentleness. The woman shrieked that she would personally tear Roxalyn into 100 pieces before she died, demanding to know how a sickly girl on the verge of death could know so much. Realizing Carmel had completely lost her mind, the butler ordered the guards to cover her head and blindfold her before dragging her away, exactly as the young lady had previously instructed. Watching her opponent's back disappear into the distance, Roxalyn smiled coldly to herself as she remembered the answer. In her previous life, Makluxa had aggressively tried to recruit her into the organization. She proudly remembered why. They had coveted her ruthless abilities so badly that they had practically begged her to become their queen and lead them. Returning her attention to the dining table, the young lady politely bowed and apologized for interrupting the family dinner, prompting Uncle Aegis to laugh delightedly and declare that she had just rendered an extraordinary service to the Bellion family. When Ian smugly declared that his instincts had been dead on because he had smelled drama coming from Roxalyn from the start, the young lady calmly said she was glad to have been of some help, then announced that she had something important to say while the whole family was present. The young lady's sudden announcement that she wanted to pack up and leave this house made her father Chirty freeze for several seconds, as his face visibly changed. She casually explained that after checking, she discovered she did not own a single asset in her own name, so she wanted permission to take a few pieces of jewelry as travel money, making her father jolt and loudly ask why. Confused, Churty pressed her with questions, demanding why she had suddenly decided to leave so abruptly. Looking up at her father's gloomy face, Roxalyn wondered in disbelief whether this cold man had actually initiated a direct conversation with her for the first time in ages. She thought that in both her previous life and this one, she could count on one hand the number of times she had ever had a proper conversation with her father, then smiled when she read the worry hidden beneath his words. When the young lady assured him that moving abroad would not stain the family's reputation, hoping to ease his concerns, her father jumped and explained that was not what he meant, then snapped that a frail girl like her was being far too reckless. Watching her father's trembling, awkward hand tighten around his ring, she sensed his intense anxiety as he blamed himself for making his daughter feel that he was someone she could not rely on. Roxalyn told him not to worry too much and promised to remove her name from the Bellion family register before leaving, while inwardly feeling grateful that the family had not abandoned her and had raised a sickly, illegitimate child like her. She thought that even though there had been no warmth between father and daughter in her previous life, being unable to attend his funeral had remained a regret that haunted her for the rest of her life. Deep within her heart, the image of the lonely, chronically ill child she once was, bedridden year after year, suddenly resurfaced with painful clarity. She remembered the long days of waiting, secretly hoping her family would throw open the door and come hug her like in one of those heartwarming fairy tales. No longer willing to cling to false hopes only to be crushed by disappointment. All she wanted now was freedom and a quiet place where no one knew her, somewhere she could peacefully retire. She firmly declared that she had burdened the family for far too long, so before leaving, she would personally negotiate with the royal family to cancel her engagement to the third prince and fulfill one final duty. But before she could finish promising to protect the family's honor, her father's furious shout cut her off and sent an armchair crashing backward onto the floor. Trembling with anger, Churty declared that he would never allow her to do something so foolish, berated her for taking the royal engagement lightly, and coldly ordered her back to her room to take her medicine and rest. He angrily brought up the ridiculous commotion she had caused the day before that had embarrassed the entire family, then scolded her for wanting to run off and cause even more trouble, leaving Roxalyn silently staring at him in confusion. The young lady tilted her head slightly, puzzled by her father's wildly excessive outburst. Churty clicked his tongue in irritation, spun around, and strode away decisively under the frightened eyes of the servants. The door slammed shut with cold finality, making Uncle Ian beside her shrug awkwardly and lament that this family's atmosphere was one step away from total collapse. Seeing his niece about to slip back to her room, Ian hurriedly called after her and awkwardly tried to smooth things over, explaining that her father was not acting so harshly because he hated her. The young uncle explained that Churty was simply catastrophically bad at showing affection, making Roxalyn smile politely and thank him for his thoughtful concern. The sudden sweetness with which his niece called him uncle made Ian break out in goosebumps, and he stared at her in horror, wondering why she had been addressing him so distantly only moments ago. She turned with a bright, mischievous smile and explained that she had only done that to get under stubborn Carmel's skin, then elegantly bowed and excused herself. Her niece's lightning-fast change of attitude left the Duke and Ian, father and son, frozen as they stared at each other in astonishment. Her grandfather, the Duke, burst into delighted laughter at his granddaughter's unexpectedly sharp and forceful personality, fondly muttering that she really was a stubborn little brat. Ian irritably demanded what was so funny, then leaned an arm over his chair and complained about why his father was always so harsh, conveniently exposing grandfather himself as the root cause of all this family's misunderstanding and drama. He openly admitted that his own reckless stubbornness came straight from his father, then went on and on about how the youngest son, Churty, had only grown into such a gloomy and withdrawn man because their father had raised him far too strictly. Ian continued needling him for stubbornly refusing to kick Carmel out sooner, and loudly accused his father of being the one destroying this family, making the Duke explode in fury. Ian quickly escaped toward the door, not forgetting to tell his father to clean up this mess and keep their only granddaughter from leaving, while the Duke roared after him and cursed his useless, ungrateful sons for never taking responsibility for anything. But once outside, the red-haired uncle suddenly stopped and let out a heavy sigh, admitting to himself that despite all his tough talk, he had spent far too long wandering around outside and neglecting his family, and now it was time for him to step in and help his youngest brother Cherty untangle his feelings. A few days later, a timid maid entered the room and softly called to Lady Roxalyn, who was sitting at her vanity. When the maid reported that the young uncle had once again sent flowers with a congratulatory card, the young lady could only ask wearily whether it was him again. She opened the elegant black envelope and found a short, awkward message from her uncle claiming that he had simply happened to pick up the flowers on the road. Roxalyn placed the card over her face in exasperation and wondered whether, ever since that conversation, her stubborn uncle had somehow been possessed, because his behavior had become downright bizarre. And that was not all. Her room was now overflowing with towering baskets of fresh flowers that her father Cherty secretly sent her every single day. Looking at the cards with absurd messages like, "They were on sale, I happened to pass by," or "Flowers grow everywhere anyway," she did not know whether to laugh or cry as she wondered if these strange notes were her father's awkward declarations of affection or veiled threats. She sighed inwardly that her father really did not need to force himself this hard just to make things up to her. With a self-mocking smile, she thought that in her father's eyes, she was probably no different from those worthless roadside wildflowers he had casually picked up on a whim. Unable to stand the suffocating room thick with the scent of flowers, she coldly ordered the maid to throw them all away and, from now on, toss out any flowers sent to her without exception, leaving the maid to bow and obey. When the butler respectfully informed her that the royal carriage was ready in the hall, the young lady elegantly announced that she would leave at once. The maids whispered timidly behind her when they saw her heading to the palace in a completely black dress, wondering why she liked black when it was normally reserved for funerals, before remembering that she herself had ordered all the old, ragged clothes Carmel used to force her to wear thrown away. Another maid sadly explained that those black dresses were actually the only decent outfits left in her impoverished wardrobe, making the others murmur in sympathy and pity. Seeing the servants gossiping, an older maid sharply shushed them and warned everyone to keep their mouths shut unless they wanted the butler to deal with them, while reminding them of Carmel's miserable fate as proof that the young lady now had everyone's secrets in her grasp and was terrifyingly dangerous. The narration declared that she had now completely transformed into a regal queen, decisively casting off the image of the timid, gloomy young lady who had once been so easy to bully. The magnificent and imposing Dianitas royal palace rose majestically beneath a brilliant blue sky. Walking through the luxurious palace corridor, Roxalyn reflected that she had somehow ended up setting foot once again in this place filled with complicated ties from her past. As she wondered how long it had been since she last saw the third prince, the study door suddenly creaked open, making her pause in surprise at the figure seated inside. Third Prince Arma Dianitas, wearing his glasses, shot out of his chair the moment he saw his fiancée, his face turning bright red as he shyly stammered a greeting to the young lady. When she greeted him politely and formally, the young prince waved his hands in flustered protest and earnestly begged her not to use such distant, formal titles with him anymore. Hurriedly taking her black-gloved hand, Arma anxiously asked after her health because he had heard she had fallen ill following that terrifying failed suicide attempt, then gently invited her to sit and talk. Roxalyn gave him a reassuring smile, saying she had fully recovered and apologizing for having been such an inconsiderate fiancé all this time, making the prince happily breathe a small sigh of relief. Cutting through the sweetness, the young lady went straight to the point and announced that she had something extremely important to discuss, prompting Arma to nod awkwardly and tell her to say whatever she needed. She calmly proposed completely ending their engagement, instantly turning the atmosphere in the room cold and suffocating. The harsh proposal echoed through the silent room, leaving the poor third prince utterly stunned. His lips trembled as Arma stammered in confusion, asking whether he was too useless and weak or had unknowingly done something to upset her so badly that she would treat him this cruelly. She insisted that the decision was entirely her own, then coldly asked him to arrange an audience with the emperor so she could explain everything herself, causing the devastated prince to collapse back into his chair. Seeing his excessively pained reaction, Roxalyn blinked in genuine surprise. Arma rushed forward and dropped to his knees at her feet, desperately clutching her hands and pleading that he absolutely did not want this to happen. With tears rolling down behind his glasses, he humbled himself and begged her to tell him what she truly wanted, promising to do everything in his power to grant any wish she had, as long as she would not cruelly abandon him without a reason. Roxalyn narrowed her eyes uneasily at the young man crying miserably at her feet, thinking that she had known someone as gentle as him would be hurt, but she had never expected him to resist this fiercely when their bond at this point should have been so faint. The narration opened a bloody, tear-filled memory from her previous life, when she owed him an enormous debt. After she left her family, he had secretly fled with her and, in the end, shielded her with his own body and sacrificed his life for her. Because of that overwhelming debt, all she wanted in this life was for him to find a good woman who deserved him more than she did and live a genuinely happy life. She wished that the woman who someday walked beside him would be her complete opposite, not someone cold and sharp as thorns, impossible for anyone to truly harmonize with. Though she knew breaking off the engagement now would tear his heart apart, she hoped he would forgive her someday, then coldly crushed his remaining hope by telling him to stop humiliating himself any further. She cruelly added that such weakness and spinelessness would only make everyone around him despise and look down on him even more, leaving the prince rigid with shock. Rising abruptly and pulling her hands away, she described her ideal man as someone with a bright future, an unbreakable will, bold masculine spirit, and a rebellious streak that cared little for the rules. She calmly rubbed salt into his wounded heart by saying that such a man had absolutely nothing in common with a timid, weak prince like him, then coldly told him to let go so she could leave while he tearfully called her name. She firmly declared that if he could not even handle something as minor as arranging an audience with the emperor, then they had nothing left to discuss, and she turned away without hesitation despite his desperate cries behind her. Using the little strength he had left, Arma weakly grabbed the hem of her black dress and begged her not to leave him so cruelly. Lowering his head and accepting the harsh reality, the young prince swallowed his tears and promised he would do everything he could to arrange her audience with the emperor, if that was truly the only thing she wanted right now. Having secured his promise, she gave a relieved little smile and casually thanked him for putting up with her difficult request, while Arma could only blame himself for being too incompetent and useless to deserve her love. Seeing the suffering young man reflected in the large mirror, she screamed a sincere apology inside her heart, admitting that every insult she had just spoken was a lie, because she had never hated or looked down on him for being weak. On the contrary, she treasured him precisely because he was the most loyal and devoted man in the world, the only person who had patiently stayed by her side and protected her even when her suspicious nature made her keep pushing him away. But because she wanted to keep him alive in this lifetime, she had no choice but to play the villainess and force him away, telling herself that this safe distance was the best thing for him right now. Cutting off those dark thoughts, she strode coldly toward the door and announced that she was leaving the prince's anguished cry behind her. Arma tried to salvage one final shred of hope by timidly asking whether, after the engagement ended, they could at least remain ordinary friends. She whipped around and immediately poured ice water over that hope, bluntly warning that if he did not want to destroy the last scraps of her reputation, he had better abandon that ridiculous idea, making him flinch in fear. With a cold, emotionless farewell, she turned her back and walked decisively into the wide corridor. Unable to accept it, the prince hurried after her down the lavish hallway, loudly trying to explain himself and pleading for her to stop and listen. But the dramatic chase suddenly halted when a familiar, arrogant voice rang out sarcastically from behind them. Roxalin's gaze hardened with fury as she cursed inwardly upon realizing that the person blocking her path was the one man in the world she hated most and least wanted to see. The second prince appeared with an arrogant expression and a group of stern guards, sneering that the two of them were the most pathetic, ridiculous couple he had ever seen. He spread his arms theatrically and loudly mocked their love story as a legendary romance that would give the whole world something to laugh at for generations. The second prince kept digging cruelly at his useless youngest brother, who supposedly could not even catch an ant, and at the gloomy young lady infamous for her chronic stutter, leaving Arma beside her only able to lower his head and weakly call out to his older brother. But the moment he finished, he stepped closer and provocatively lifted Roxalin's chin, smirking that lately she had started looking far more presentable and womanly than before. His disrespectful fingers stroked her cheek as he whispered another filthy flirtation, saying she had become so alluring lately that she was making him feel unexpectedly restless and excited. Watching his fiancée being crudely pawed right in front of him, Arma suddenly gathered all his courage, rushed forward, grabbed his brother's wrist, and loudly condemned the behavior as an insult to Lady Roxalin's honor. Seeing his weak youngest brother actually dare defy him and knock his hand away, the second prince's eyes hardened with savage menace as he sneered and asked whether he was seeing things. Without warning, a devastating punch slammed straight into Arma's face, sending his glasses flying as he crashed painfully to the floor. The brutal second prince lunged at his poor brother and stomped on him as he curled up helplessly, beating and cursing the brat for suddenly pretending to have a backbone in front of his fiancée. He launched another vicious kick and declared that fiancé or not, once he said something belonged to him, no one else was allowed to lay a finger on it. Grinding his teeth as he brutally pinned his brother beneath his shoe, he shouted that from now on Arma was forbidden to question or disobey him and should behave like an obedient dog. Even after being beaten until his skin split and bled, Arma gritted his teeth and forced himself up, weakly protesting that Lady Roxalin would never belong to a cruel man like him. Using his last bit of strength, the frail prince lunged forward and wrapped his arms tightly around the second prince's waist in a desperate attempt to restrain him, making the man shout in surprise. Arma's bloodshot red eyes blazed with a determination no one had ever seen before as he shouted that she belonged with him and that only he deserved to stand by her side. Seeing the useless younger brother stubbornly refuse to submit, the second prince flew into a rage, cursed him as an untrainable idiot, and viciously declared that today would be the day of his death. While the second prince wildly swung his fists and brutally stomped on him, intending to beat him into permanent disability as a lesson he would never forget, Arma still clung to the man's leg with his thin body and cried for the young lady to run somewhere safe. Standing there watching the bloody violence unfold before her, Roxalin merely narrowed her eyes in silence and sighed sadly, thinking that the young prince truly was the most foolish man in the world. A reflective thought surfaced that even in this lifetime, Roxalin was still the kind of person who could never stand by and watch injustice, and she silently decided that enough was enough. Her decisive footsteps struck the cold floor, signaling that the young lady had chosen to step in and confront the troublemaker herself. Seeing her suddenly appear, the arrogant second prince could only blurt out in annoyed surprise, while Yuldian, sprawled on the floor, looked up and weakly called to his lady. Roxalin gently asked Yuldian whether he could stand on his own, and the prince shyly hurried to apologize and thank her as he took the warm hand she offered to help him up. She calmly told him that in the end, the two of them no longer needed to bother scheduling an audience with the emperor, making Yuldian start and awkwardly ask whether he had done something wrong again. Roxalin gave a dazzling, heart-stopping smile and denied it, leisurely explaining that she had just thought of a much faster shortcut to meet the emperor. Yuldian's face turned red as he stared blankly at her, apparently completely captivated by his fiancée's regal beauty and unexpectedly confident smile. Roxalin's gaze suddenly hardened with fury as she threatened the stubborn second prince, saying that if he dared touch her man, she would personally teach him some manners. A sharp slap cracked through the air as Roxalin struck the arrogant second prince across the face, leaving him shouting in pain and disbelief. Witnessing the shocking violence right before their eyes, the palace servants could only gape in horror and cover their mouths in fear. The second prince's face turned crimson as he screamed to ask what the hell she thought she was doing, threatening that this was treason against the royal family and attempted murder of a prince. But Roxalin answered with calm sarcasm. She indifferently asked why he had dared lay hands on her fiancé in the first place, adding that the sight had irritated her immensely. When he angrily roared that he was a noble prince of the empire, she coldly pointed out that her fiancé was a prince too, causing the crowd around them to erupt into whispers. He sneered contemptuously that some nobody like Yuldian had no right to call himself a prince, then acted as though he had just realized something incredibly funny. He mockingly picked at her old wound by bringing up the rumor that she too was an illegitimate child, then sarcastically declared that the two of them truly were a match made in heaven. Looking at the madman's smug expression, Roxalin narrowed her eyes coldly and thought that even a painful slap had not been enough to teach him a lasting lesson. Another thunderous slap rang out and made him clutch his face with a scream, while she casually pretended to explain that her hand had slipped, adding that she had a bad habit of automatically correcting things whenever she heard a dog barking. Running a hand through her hair with a wicked smile, she declared that since this foolish dog kept barking nonsense at her fiancé, she truly had no choice but to punish it. Humiliated in front of everyone, the second prince shook with rage and ground his teeth as he cursed her as a damned woman. Seeing him about to swing a fist, she calmly closed her eyes and inwardly dared him to hit her, because taking one punch from him would make it even easier for the emperor to settle this disturbance exactly the way she wanted. A dull impact rang out, and a pair of glasses shattered as they flew away, but the person who took that brutal punch was not the young lady. Roxalin opened her eyes wide in confusion, the worried question on her lips stopping halfway when she saw the unexpected scene. Yuldian, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth, was holding her tightly in his arms to protect her, while anxiously asking whether she had been hurt anywhere. She called his name in shock as conflicting emotions surged inside her, realizing that he had foolishly used his own body to take the devastating punch for her. Hearing his pained groan, she panicked and pointed at the split wound at the corner of the frail prince's mouth, where blood was flowing freely. When she scolded him for recklessly jumping in, Yuldian merely gave a sweet, awkward smile and replied that he could hardly stand by and watch his fiancée get hurt, making her sigh inwardly that he was loyal to the point of foolishness. The second prince sneered at their cheap hero saves the beauty act, as if Yuldian were already on death's door, only to be interrupted by the stern royal butler announcing a confidential order from the emperor. Recognizing his father's man, the second prince immediately grew arrogant again, loudly accusing the two of insulting him and deserving punishment before eagerly asking what the emperor intended to do to them. But the butler coldly announced that the emperor's order was for the second prince to be confined to his quarters immediately until further notice, making him scream in shock that he was the one being punished instead of Yuldian. He wildly denied the absurdity of it, shouting that everyone had seen he was the victim who had been slapped several times, even accusing Roxalin of attempting to murder a prince and demanding that the butler ask again. The butler maintained perfect composure, promising to relay his words to His Majesty, but insisting that for now he must strictly obey the confinement order, while declaring that the emperor's judgment was exceptionally wise, leaving the prince to curse the damned idea of justice. In fury, he stomped his heel so hard against the stone floor that cracks spread beneath it, growling that everyone knew the emperor always favored his ambitious eldest son and the bastard Yuldian. As he stormed away in humiliation, The second prince turned back and threatened the idle servants watching nearby, demanding whether they thought this was some kind of comedy show. Roxalyn shook her head in exasperation and thought that the second prince threw tantrums at the slightest provocation worse than a child, when the butler turned to her with grave respect and announced that His Majesty wished to see her immediately. Thinking he was the one being summoned, Yuldian awkwardly said he understood and asked whether he should go at once, but the butler quickly clarified that the person His Majesty had summoned was absolutely not the third prince. The butler respectfully gestured for Lady Bellion to proceed first, leaving Yuldian beside her utterly stunned by surprise. Roxalyn lightly touched her earring, thinking that although her hand and ear still ached a little from the performance just now, the outcome was perfect, and she calmly agreed to the audience. The elegant young lady asked the butler to lead the way to His Majesty, opening the door to an upcoming meeting full of schemes and mental warfare with the ruler of the empire. The imposing figure of the emperor appeared with his back turned, echoing the butler's firm reminder that the person summoned was not the third prince. The declaration that His Majesty had personally called for Lady Bellion rang out, making Roxalyn smugly think that this was turning into an even more profitable deal than expected. With a bright, confident smile, she decisively told the butler to lead her to the emperor, showing not the slightest fear. Seeing her go alone, Yuldian anxiously tried to follow and protect her, but she quickly stopped him and told him to see the royal physician instead, because she did not want anyone seeing her fiancé looking this pathetic. The sweet teasing made the prince blush and murmur shyly, while she strode away behind the bowing butler, who respectfully led the way. Watching his fiancé's elegant figure disappear into the distance, Yuldian awkwardly lifted his white-gloved hand to touch his burning cheek, his face filled with happiness and fluttering emotion. The firm click of her high heels struck the luxurious red carpet as she followed the butler toward the partially open doors of the magnificent study. The butler stopped outside, knocked, and formally announced to the emperor that Lady Roxalyn had arrived for the promised audience. The emperor leisurely sipped his tea, curled his lips into a meaningful smile, and greeted her by asking how she had been lately. His Majesty Severus Jin Dionytus, Supreme Emperor of the Dionytus Empire, sat imposingly in a golden armchair and casually remarked that her aura had changed quite a bit recently. When she respectfully offered the formal greeting that by the grace of the Empire's son she remained in good health, the emperor burst into laughter and sarcastically remarked that such a greeting was remarkably shameless, coming from a girl who had just personally caused a disturbance in the palace hall. The emperor lightly tapped his jewel-ringed fingers against the table and curiously asked what someone who had always valued safety above all else was plotting to make her dare create such chaos in the palace. Her crimson eyes glanced around before she asked His Majesty to dismiss the attendants because she had an extremely confidential matter to discuss in private, making the emperor wonder thoughtfully what could possibly require such secrecy. Roxalyn lifted her chin and straightforwardly declared that her greatest wish right now was to completely break off her engagement to third Prince Yuldian. Though clearly surprised, the emperor remained composed, invited her to sit and have some tea, then ordered the butler to leave, and she softly thanked him for his consideration. Once the doors closed and left them alone, the emperor calmly invited the young lady to speak freely about her true thoughts regarding ending the engagement to his son. She confirmed it without hesitation and offered him a tempting deal. If he agreed to cancel the engagement, she would personally resolve the two greatest problems currently giving the emperor headaches, making him raise an eyebrow and repeat the claim skeptically. She slowly explained that the first problem was the deadlocked negotiation with the barbarous land of Kaluta concerning the division of the empire's northern border. The second, painfully urgent problem appeared on wanted notices posted everywhere. A string of mysterious disappearances with no trace, occurring repeatedly across several regions. The emperor's lips curled dangerously as he expressed surprise and wondered how a sickly young lady who supposedly spent all year shut away at home could know such classified national information, while inwardly suspecting there was a serious information leak somewhere in the palace. Her sharp instincts recognized this as a life-or-death gamble, but she confidently placed her bet because she knew the major events in this world and the parallel world of her previous life would unfold almost identically. Knowing full well that she could never tell the emperor the absurd truth about her reincarnation, she cleverly fabricated a story that she had luckily awakened a mysterious power after her recent near-death experience. At the mention of mysterious power, the emperor's eyes lit up, and he asked whether she had awakened the legendary Abyss ability, and the young lady smiled and nodded decisively. The narration introduced Abyss, a special power that awakened entirely at random and under mysterious circumstances, whose true origin remained one of humanity's greatest unanswered questions. The power had been named after an ancient word meaning a bottomless depth, because it only emerged when a person was driven into a life-or-death crisis, making Roxalyn smugly think that her earlier failed suicide attempt was the perfect excuse to make everything sound plausible. The emperor clapped in delight and congratulated her, declaring that this was truly sensational news for the entire empire, while the young lady calmly returned his smile. When she slyly revealed that His Majesty was the first person she had trusted with this earth-shattering secret, the emperor laughed and joked that he supposed he should consider that a great honor, adding that her father and grandfather would probably be hurt if they ever found out. Putting the joking aside, the emperor set down his teacup and narrowed his eyes, asking what miraculous abyss ability she possessed that made her so confident she could solve problems even the ruler of the empire had been unable to handle. Roxalyn cleverly turned the question around, pointing out that His Majesty was perfectly capable of resolving everything himself. He simply wanted to clean up the mess as quietly and discreetly as possible, making the emperor's expression change as he asked why he would need to go to such trouble. Her crimson eyes fixed dangerously on him as she bluntly said the reason was the bloody purge the emperor was secretly preparing to carry out against the ruling aristocracy, leaving him completely stunned. After several suffocating seconds of silence, the emperor suddenly let out a weary laugh at the terrifying insight of the Bellian young lady standing before him, far beyond what her age should allow. The emperor narrowed his eyes at her and admitted that he had gone to great lengths to seal off every source of information, yet she had uncovered everything so easily that she had truly put him in an awkward position. Roxalyn took a small sip of red tea, smugly thinking that she had finally forced the old fox ruling the empire to reveal the sharp and ruthless face beneath his mask. The world mockingly called him the Clown Emperor because he always stood on the sidelines and laughed at every crisis, but the narration revealed that just 1 year from now, this very clown would draw his own sword and begin a bloody massacre to purge the nobility. In that storm of blood, where more than 2/3 of the upper class would either be executed or stripped of all their property, the once renowned Bellian family in her previous life had suffered the same tragic fate, unable to escape the king's merciless purge. Looking straight into the emperor's eyes, she calmly stated that the names of her Bellian family members were surely already written on his list of people to be eliminated. She guessed her troublesome uncle was almost certainly among those marked for removal, but she asked the emperor to show mercy and spare the direct Bellian bloodline so the family could survive. The emperor gave a faint, calculating laugh and asked whether she realized that she wanted both to end her engagement to the third prince and have him protect her entire family, which seemed to leave him taking the bigger loss in this deal. She firmly countered that her troublesome uncle was actually an extremely useful piece for the emperor's greater plans, confidently adding that His Majesty knew perfectly well this partnership was a very profitable bargain for him. As for canceling the engagement, she explained that although the marriage was a hot topic among the upper class, at its core it was merely a public show of power and a symbol of the close alliance between the royal family and Duke Bellian's house. She firmly guaranteed that married or not, House Bellion would never betray the royal family, and that the emperor understood their loyalty better than anyone, leaving him silent in thought. After considering it carefully, the emperor rubbed his chin with a meaningful smile and agreed to approve her request to cancel the engagement on the condition that she successfully resolved the two problems exactly as promised. The emperor sighed regretfully and asked whether she truly disliked his son that much, even though the boy might be timid but possessed looks worthy of being called the son of Aphrodite, making her smile awkwardly and claim that he was simply too perfect for someone like her. She changed the subject and asked His Majesty to keep both her awakened ability and today's entire disturbance completely secret, and the emperor cheerfully nodded and agreed to keep his mouth shut. When the emperor personally apologized for the fight caused earlier by his second son, Roxalyn quickly brushed it aside and said she needed neither compensation nor empty words of apology. Instead of demanding restitution, the young lady's eyes suddenly gleamed with calculation as she asked the emperor to grant one more small request. Stepping out of the royal study, Roxalyn quietly pulled the magnificent doors shut, leaned her back against them, and let out a long breath to release the suffocating tension from the intense conversation. As she silently complained about how hard she had worked to match wits with the old fox emperor without revealing a single weakness, Yuldian's worried voice suddenly sounded right beside her, asking whether the conversation had gone well. Roxalyn jumped in surprise, her eyes widening as she wondered how this frail prince had managed to approach her in complete silence like some wandering ghost. Regaining her composure, she asked whether he had been standing there waiting for her the whole time, making him awkwardly scratch his cheek and claim that he had merely happened to hear that His Majesty intended to see him. Yuldian happily showed off the cut on his face, now carefully covered by a small bandage from the royal physician, then shyly asked whether he finally looked like a fiancé she could be proud of, rather than embarrassed by. The young lady nodded and admitted that the wound had been treated well, making the prince blush as he timidly suggested that she could touch it herself to make sure the bandage had been applied properly. Seeing his adorable, expectant expression, Roxalyn smiled inwardly and thought that if he wanted it badly enough to practically beg, she did not mind indulging him a little. She gently placed her black-gloved hand against Yuldian's soft cheek, making the prince beam with delight and close his eyes to savor her warm, sweet touch. But then she suddenly withdrew her hand and coldly warned him never to foolishly shield her again, because the second prince's punch had been part of her calculations, and she had deliberately intended to let herself get hit. Yuldian turned toward her in shock and asked why she would do such a thing, so she explained that just as the second prince had said, the incident could easily be treated as an insult to the royal family or attempted murder of a prince, a perfect excuse to force the emperor into a compromise. When he painfully argued that she had only done it to protect him, she cruelly poured cold water over him by saying that even if she were in desperate trouble, a powerless and incompetent person like him would be no help to her whatsoever. Yuldian's face went pale from the deep wound inflicted by her razor-sharp words, and she coldly emphasized that he should never again waste his effort trying to carry her burdens for her. After that harsh farewell, she calmly turned and walked away, leaving the prince frozen in lonely, wounded silence. Watching her back recede, Yuldian only dared apologize that his bruised, miserable face made him unable to escort her to the carriage, causing the young lady's elegant steps to pause for a moment. Without turning around, Roxalyn quietly said that she would see him next time, making the poor prince smile faintly and answer yes with visible relief. Walking down the corridor, Roxalyn tortured herself wondering what he had even done wrong to be apologizing to her, when in truth her own stubbornness and coldness had always been the barrier keeping him trapped inside his timid shell. Yuldian gently pushed open the door and stepped inside, the creak of the hinges tearing through the heavy silence. Lady Roxalyn slowly descended the magnificent gold-trimmed stairs, the crisp strike of her heels against the floor sounding every bit as commanding and glamorous as she looked. Seeing her practically sprinting away, Marquise Jeroen called after her from behind and asked where she was rushing off to. Roxalyn glanced back and casually said he had finally bothered to show up when she had been waiting so long she was practically growing roots. Marquise Jeroen Wilbrid appeared as elegant as ever, wearing his usual mysterious smile and carrying a polished cane that looked every bit as luxurious as he did. The scene shifted back to the palace, where the youngest Prince Yuldian politely bowed to the emperor and asked after his father's health after being absent for so long, while the emperor sneered that his youngest son had finally decided to show his face. The emperor sighed and lightly complained that his children only remembered him when they needed something, making Yuldian awkwardly scratch his head, apologize with a nervous laugh, and promise to visit more often from now on. Seeing his son's overly theatrical expression, the emperor casually waved him off and told him there was no need to tire himself out pretending. The emperor's gaze suddenly sharpened as he announced that he had already sent away every guard and servant, so father and son could drop the fake polite script. Caught so suddenly in his habit of social posturing, Prince Yuldian froze for several seconds, sweat beading on his face as he blankly asked what his father meant. Recovering, he forced another awkward smile and waved his hands defensively, pretending he was too foolish to understand the deeper meaning behind his father's words. The emperor burst out laughing and teased that Roxalyn herself had once asked him to send Yuldian away, then privately thought that his son and this fiancée of his truly made a naturally ridiculous pair. The father suddenly turned serious and questioned his youngest son. He pointed out that he had never summoned Yuldian to the palace today, so he wanted to know the real reason the boy had come here on his own. Yuldian lightly gripped the curtain and lowered his voice, admitting that there was something extremely important he wanted to ask his father directly. The emperor studied him carefully upon hearing his normally quiet youngest son address him with such unusual seriousness. Inside, the father wondered what the hell had gotten into this child, who was usually as silent as a clam. Back in the study, Yuldian slowly prepared tea and poured it into a cup, trying to steady himself before beginning the battle of wits. The young prince gently set the teapot down and calmly sat on the sofa across from his father. As he poured gleaming red tea into the cup, Yuldian earnestly asked his father to tell him the truth. The emperor immediately asked whether his son wanted to know what had been said in the secret conversation between him and Lady Bellion. He casually shrugged and said the answer was obvious. He had simply warned her not to cross the line again, ordered her to attend the royal ball, and, while he was at it, dropped the shocking news that she wanted to end her engagement to Yuldian. The emperor went on to say that he had agreed to let her do as she pleased, making Yuldian freeze mid-sip in complete disbelief. Yuldian demanded to know why his father had compromised so easily, and the emperor revealed that Roxalyn had offered to take a massive problem off the royal family's hands in exchange for the deal. The emperor bluntly declared that at this moment, the usefulness of that young lady to him far exceeded that of his useless youngest son. Setting aside his wounded pride, Yuldian looked directly at his father and asked what exactly her offer had been. But the emperor simply took another sip of tea and refused with an awkward smile, saying he had promised her he would keep the matter secret from Yuldian. Yuldian immediately resorted to shameless pestering, saying that since his father had drunk tea brewed by his own hands, he had to confess everything. The emperor bitterly called that dirty play, only for Yuldian to fire back that his father had played dirty first. Unable to withstand his son's whining, the emperor finally revealed Roxalyn's two extremely tempting promises. First, to negotiate with Kaluta, and second, to investigate the mysterious disappearances, leaving Yuldian completely dumbfounded. Yuldian thoughtfully rubbed his chin, thinking that the young lady truly had changed completely, because in the past she had been so timid that a single person looking her in the eye would send her scrambling for somewhere to hide. The emperor also nodded and admitted that she was certainly behaving unusually, but in his view, as long as the change did not harm the royal family, there was no reason to waste energy worrying about it. Therefore, he firmly announced that next month, Lady Bellion would officially join the diplomatic delegation traveling to Kaluta. Hearing that, Yuldian immediately declared that he would volunteer to join the dangerous journey as well. The emperor sighed and warned that if he joined, he would have to shoulder full responsibility as the head of the delegation, then asked whether he understood the weight of that role, but Yuldian merely replied coldly that he had never cared for the cold throne in the first place. His father clicked his tongue and complained that a man without any ambition for power had no appeal at all, while Yuldian silently stared at his reflection in the bottom of his teacup. Seeing his son remain stubborn, the emperor dealt the decisive blow by announcing that he would send Yuldian's ambitious eldest brother in his place, making Yuldian's eyes widen with concern because he knew exactly how devious that brother could be. Elsewhere in the city, Roxalyn was on a shopping spree at an upscale fashion boutique, extremely pleased with the craftsmanship and casually buying every piece of expensive jewelry displayed in the glass cases. And she did not stop there. The young lady casually pointed across the room and demanded every decorative item displayed on the wooden shelves as well. She left everyone speechless once again when she casually swept her hand toward the rack and bought every gorgeous designer outfit hanging there too. The owner, Baron Foyer, was so delighted his face turned red as he repeatedly clasped his hands, bowed, and thanked her, while an enormous mountain of revenue practically fell into his lap. Foyer screamed inwardly as he realized this Lady Bellion was nothing like the filthy rumors. Silently cursing whoever had invented the story that she was so timid she stuttered and never dared raise her head, while Roxalyn casually told the staff to bring out the red dress and the hat beside it too. The shopkeeper was thoroughly impressed when he realized that even though she seemed to choose items simply by pointing at random, everything that caught her eye happened to be among the most expensive and sophisticated pieces in the store. He blamed himself for assuming from her simple clothing that she did not care about fashion, never imagining her taste and eye for luxury goods would be this refined. Foyer nervously asked again to make sure she truly intended to pay for the entire mountain of merchandise. The shopkeeper was dying of curiosity about the suspicious relationship between the young lady and Marquis Jarun Wilbrid, a famously shrewd merchant throughout the empire, while Jarun sat leisurely nearby and introduced the place as Foyer Boutique, one of the most luxurious fashion houses serving the royal court. The narration added that because the shop was so wildly popular, it served clients by appointment only and never took merchandise outside unless directly summoned by the royal family. Foyer thought that if a big spender was willing to buy out the entire store like this, rules were nothing but scrap paper, then bowed respectfully when Roxalyn coldly asked whether there was some problem with her shopping. He hurriedly waved his hands and told her to spend to her heart's content, after which Gerun suggested that once they had finished shopping away their stress, they should move to his villa to discuss their upcoming plans in greater detail. A dangerous gleam flashed in Roxalyn's crimson eyes as she silently agreed that the two of them certainly had a great many things to settle. Foyer timidly approached and offered her a special designer dress as a personal gift of thanks for her enthusiastic patronage, making Roxalyn smile lightly, accept, and ask his name so she would remember him. She lavishly praised every product in the store as a perfect 10 in both quality and design, then cleverly baited him by remarking that running a boutique of this caliber must allow him to hear a great deal of confidential gossip from the nobility. Foyer shrewdly bowed and assured her that the shop's lips were always sealed and would never disappoint her, making her nod in satisfaction, say she would trust him this time, and order all the merchandise delivered to the Bellion ducal estate. Just as she was about to discuss payment, Gerun suddenly cut in with a meaningful clearing of his throat, making her raise an eyebrow. Foyer's eyes nearly popped out when he saw the legendary signed check, while Jarun casually handed it over and told him he could take it straight to the bank for cash. The shopkeeper broke into a cold sweat when he saw that the total bill was only a little over 823 million Oleng, while Marquis Gerun Wilbrid's check was made out for a clean 1 billion Oleng. Jarun laughed and said the difference could be treated as a deposit, and any beautiful new dresses should simply be sent directly to the young lady. Foyer bowed deeply and thanked him over and over, promising that although the store normally operated by appointment, if either she or the Marquis ever called, he would personally be there to serve them without question. Jaron waved goodbye and withdrew, leaving the shop owner and servants still bowing deeply as they saw the pair off. But as Roxalyn passed him, she suddenly tilted her head close to Foyer's ear and whispered that this was merely unsolicited advice, so whether he listened was entirely up to him. She coldly warned that some very ugly rumors were spreading from the south, and that he would be wise to change his supplier as quickly as possible, leaving Foyer trembling in shock as he asked what she meant. Foyer hurriedly called after her for an explanation, but the only answer was the cold slam of the carriage door, cutting off all further questions. Helping her settle into the carriage, Jaroon laughed and teased that perhaps in this life she had decided to reform into a kind-hearted old lady and spend her days doing good deeds to build up virtue. Roxalyn immediately shot him down, pointing out that he had already paid a huge deposit, so it would be terribly inconvenient if that shop got caught up in an opium scandal and was shut down a year from now. Jaron awkwardly noted that the scandal would not be the owner's fault, but she cut him off at once. The young lady gave a wickedly charming smile and declared that she had always been an exceptionally gentle and kind person. A bloody image from the past appeared. Roxalyn stood proudly over countless enemy corpses with a massive blood-stained sword in hand, coldly declaring that those people had simply not yet been personally sent on their way by her. Her blood-red eyes appeared against the dark night, filled with the resentment and death of her previous life. Back in the carriage, Jaron curled his lips into a knowing smile and said he knew perfectly well what she was scheming. The Marquis leaned close to her ear and casually added a philosophical observation. Truly kind people did not go around slaughtering half the world. Roxalyn immediately fired back, warning that righteous and kind people were actually the most dangerous ones to watch, because once their moral limits were broken, they would not hesitate to draw a sword and stain it with an enemy's blood. Hearing her forceful statement, Jaron smiled and nodded in agreement that nothing in the world was more dangerous than the stubborn righteousness and obsessive kindness of a madman. He gently brushed aside the tense atmosphere and suggested that they continue discussing the matter during the rest of the ride. As the carriage rumbled through the streets, Jaron suddenly asked what dying in her previous life had actually felt like, and she casually answered that it had been incredibly freeing and relieving. The young lady bitterly confessed that just when she had decided there was no longer any reason to cling to such a meaningless life, he had cruelly thrown her into this unfamiliar world, which she found extremely irritating and troublesome. Jaron thought that out of countless parallel worlds, it was an extraordinary coincidence that they had both crossed into one so similar to their own, though he admitted this place was absurd for turning a powerful Roxalyn into a frail girl and saddling her with the ridiculous label of stuttering Roxalyn, when in reality, her tongue was sharper than ever. Roxalyn glanced out the window and explained that ever since arriving here, she had quietly investigated everything, because if she wanted to use information from her previous life, she first had to understand the rules of this new world completely. She continued that, fortunately, the two worlds were similar in many ways, and after figuring out her own circumstances, she had shifted her investigation toward him because there was one enormous question she needed answered. Looking at her reflection in the carriage window, she reminded him that he had once said it would be a waste to let her die merely as a villainess, but bluntly pointed out that in their previous life, the two of them had never been close, unless being sworn enemies constantly ready to put knives to each other's throats counted as intimacy. So she had racked her brain trying to understand why a schemer like him would go to the trouble of coming all the way to this world, because he had to be driven by some enormous ambition. Then she smiled triumphantly and announced that she had finally found the answer, the greatest difference between his life in the two parallel worlds. Jaron's gaze suddenly hardened when she exposed the truth that in this world, the Marchioness, his beloved mother, was still alive and well. Roxalyn looked directly at him and asked whether his broken relationship with his late mother was the one thing he had desperately wanted to change at any cost. Her eyes sharpened as she admitted she had never imagined he would be insane enough to cross the boundaries of space to come here, then wondered what had happened to the true owners of these two bodies after the two of them took them over. Jaren gently told her not to worry, and explained that the basic condition for a soul to enter a body in a parallel world was that the body had already breathed its last while remaining physically intact. The Marquis closed his eyes with a bitter smile and added that he had never once harbored the crazy desire to put a sword to her throat, guessing that she was the one who had always stared at him with murderous intent and then imagined the rest. Roxalyn coldly told him to spare her the nonsense, admitting that she knew her counterpart in this world had attempted suicide, though she was still surprised to learn that his counterpart here had apparently been just as pathetic. She continued pressing him, saying that as far as she knew, his abyss ability in their previous life specialized only in tracking and pursuit. So how could he possibly perform an impossible journey across space while carrying along the soul of someone already dead? Making Garun smile and ask what she thought the answer was. Roxalyn silently studied him while Garun challenged her to say the theory she had spent so much time constructing in her head. She bluntly refused, making Jarun grimace and complain in anguish that the 1 billion olang she had just wrung out of him apparently still was not enough to buy a single answer from her. The Marquis lamented that the money was nothing compared to the enormous cost of reviving someone who had been determined to kill herself, then begged her to share the theory as entertainment to pass the time on the ride back to the villa. Roxalyn glanced at him and leisurely said that if he was going to beg so desperately, she supposed she did not mind revealing her deduction. Looking straight into his eyes, she coldly asked whether he had betrayed the gods and formed an evil contract with a demon, making Garun jolt inwardly. The image of a demon's grinning mouth filled with sharp fangs flickered in the eerie darkness. Jarun lightly covered his mouth with one hand, smiling wickedly, with a fang clearly visible, as he asked in amusement whether she truly believed that. Roxalyn narrowed her eyes warily, wondering whether this old fox had finally decided to remove his false mask and reveal his terrifying true face. Seeing Garun's expression shift in surprise at her razor-sharp question about a pact with a demon, she knew she was on the right track. Watching blue flames flare brilliantly in her hand, Roxalyn explained that she suspected him because at the very moment of her death in the previous life, she clearly remembered strange green sparks surrounding her. She argued firmly that the blue flame was the clearest proof of a demon's mark, and that only the supreme power of a demon could bend space, create a parallel world, and carry dead souls across the boundaries of time, something his ordinary tracking-type abyss ability could never accomplish. Therefore, she concluded that he was not an abyss who had naturally awakened a power at all, but merely a mortal borrowing the strength of some supreme entity beyond the universe, making Garun laugh awkwardly and ask how she could be so certain from such flimsy clues, while she coldly replied that she had personally witnessed him use that sinister power far too many times. She told Jarun that how talented he was did not matter. What truly mattered was where the source of that power came from. His answer was a wicked, challenging smile, complete with an extra flash of fangs that looked both sharp and obnoxiously smug. Jaren kept speaking in a teasing tone to probe what Roxalyn was planning, while she maintained the same deadpan expression as if nothing unusual were happening. Roxalyn thought their conversation had gone nowhere, yet only a few days later her name was splashed across the front pages of several tabloids because of a scandal about a secret meeting. The tabloids freely spun the incident into a full-blown soap opera about an affair, all because mountains of expensive dresses from Foyer Boutique kept arriving at the Bellion estate. Boutique owner Foyer hurried over to apologize for allowing the rumor to leak, but Roxalyn simply reassured him that she did not doubt the shop's loyalty. Roxalyn calmly accepted the scandal because she knew rumors grew legs of their own. Not to mention, she had already anticipated this dramatic development the moment she agreed to appear in public with Garun. Thinking that getting photographed while out in a crowded street was hardly surprising, Roxalyn refused several more unnecessary apologies and sent the shop owner home. Only once she was alone did Roxalyn let out a long sigh and admit that the joke she had originally played to annoy Garoon had accidentally gone much further than her script intended. Roxalyn imagined Crown Prince Arma's completely frozen expression and guessed that her bookish fiancé was probably suffering severe emotional trauma over this scandal. But looking at it another way, she realized it was actually a golden opportunity, because a huge affair rumor like this was the perfect excuse to kick that troublesome royal engagement to the curb. Roxalyn remained completely relaxed, smirking, because the one running himself ragged trying to put out the scandal was Garin, the man currently losing his mind trying to make peace with his Marchioness wife. Even so, to avoid pointless misunderstandings within a family that still did not understand the full situation, Roxalyn decided to personally clear things up. Roxalyn confidently pushed open the dining room doors of the Bellion estate, where the entire family was gathered around an extravagant feast. The atmosphere froze instantly when her father Cherty slammed the table with a bang and roared that she was forbidden from getting involved with a married man. In sharp contrast to her father's explosion, her second older brother Ian Bellion laughed with delight and teased that the moment his little sister stopped being gloomy, she immediately started causing trouble. Ian slowly sipped his red wine and looked at her with amusement, clearly entertained by the dangerous game of playing with fire she had just thrown herself into. Roxalyn remembered that in her previous life, Ian had been a notorious troublemaker, eventually eliminated by the royal family. But this time he had survived because she had struck a life-for-deal agreement with the Emperor. Roxalyn felt secretly proud that she had successfully changed fate by throwing stepmother Carmel out of the house and cutting off the family tragedy before it even had a chance to start. She was confident that in this life she was more than capable of protecting her reckless older brother from the death she had seen him meet before. Seeing his daughter standing there lost in thought, Cherty impatiently shouted at her, forcing Roxalyn to break off her thoughts and begin explaining what had happened with Garin. Cherty's face immediately changed shape as he stammered in a mix of jealousy and shock after hearing his precious daughter casually call that Marquise by his first name. Realizing her father had entered an overly sensitive mode, Roxalyn smoothly tried to diffuse the situation, insisting that the two of them had only happened to become acquainted and were working together on a small business matter. Cherty clutched his head and let out a long, helpless sigh, warning his daughter that Garin was a master schemer and asking how she could be foolish enough to walk straight into his trap. Roxalyn mentally raised a question mark at her father's unusually intense concern, wondering whether he was merely afraid she would tarnish the family's reputation. Roxalyn sharply replied that she had not embarrassed the family and knew her position perfectly well without needing flowers or letters from her father to remind her, making Cherty freeze for several seconds. Looking at all the luxurious letters and flowers, Roxalyn bitterly reflected that this father had never once shown her even a fraction of such concern in the past. Turning an icy gaze on him, Roxalyn bluntly declared that these sudden displays of concern through flowers and letters only made her feel more burdened. Inside, Roxalyn suddenly remembered her lonely childhood, when the little girl she once was had spent years longing to feel her father's arms around her even once. But the disgusted expression he had worn back then had slapped her out of that dream, teaching her to give up and accept the life of a rejected illegitimate child. Having lived through 2 lifetimes, Roxalyn was certain her father had never loved her, and she had buried every bit of filial affection she once held for him a very long time ago. Roxalyn thanked her father for raising her despite barely paying attention to her, then coldly concluded that he did not need to worry because she would remove herself from the picture so she would no longer get in the family's way. Cherty's face twisted with pain as he bit his lip with trembling teeth and weakly offered belated denials against the barrage of words cutting into him. To break apart the gloomy atmosphere, Roxalyn lifted her chin and announced that she wanted to make a major decision in front of the entire family and her troublesome uncle. Roxalyn boldly declared that she was going to throw away her engagement to the third crown prince, leaving every man in the dining room completely frozen in confusion. The experienced, scar-faced uncle immediately turned serious and went straight to the key question. Had the mighty emperor actually approved such a shocking decision? Roxalyn knew perfectly well that the old fox emperor would never willingly cancel a political marriage designed to reinforce his power. With determined crimson eyes, Roxalyn frankly admitted that she had personally struck a special secret deal with the emperor. That mentally exhausting transaction with the ruler of the empire was directly connected to the upcoming diplomatic negotiations in Kaluta. And the price of the deal was that Roxalyn would have to personally clean up the string of mysterious disappearances currently terrifying the capital's population. Roxalyn casually dropped another bomb by announcing that she would soon pack her bags and head to Kaluta, nearly making her father and red-haired uncle's hearts stop from shock. She calmly explained that Jarun would accompany her as a bodyguard, while all those dresses were simply compensation he had been required to give her. Hearing his niece explain that she had taken advantage of the opportunity to demand clothes because her wardrobe was practically empty, the red-haired uncle frowned with concern and pressed for the full story. Roxalyn exposed without hesitation that stepmother Carmel had stolen or destroyed nearly everything in her wardrobe, making Cherty jerk in shock and fall silent with regret. The red-haired uncle boiled with rage and roared about Carmel's cruelty and audacity in treating his niece that way. Roxalyn, by contrast, calmly told him to cool down and admitted that some of the blame was hers for remaining silent and enduring it for so long. She felt sorry for the original owner of this body, a girl who had only known how to grit her teeth and suffer in silence because she feared being called weak when she had no one to support her. But the Roxalyn of today was different. She had already walked through death once, and she swore she would use every trick available to reclaim justice, rather than ever play the helpless victim again. The red-haired uncle rubbed his forehead and sighed at his niece's casual tone, as if she were recounting someone else's story, though inwardly he was relieved that the immediate crisis had finally settled down. With everything said, Roxalyn casually rose from her seat and prepared to leave the dining table, wrapping up the family meeting quickly and efficiently. Seeing his daughter move so decisively, Cherty panicked and called after her in a trembling voice, desperately trying to make her stay. Overwhelming fear swallowed Cherty's mind as he realized that if he let Roxalyn walk away this time, she might sever their father-daughter relationship forever. Inside, Cherty screamed for his daughter not to leave, even though all his life he had longed to open his arms and hold her, but had never found the courage. He bitterly remembered his cursed luck, how everyone he loved deeply had always slipped cruelly through his fingers like grains of sand. Cherty carried the cursed blood of the Abyss clan, having awakened a terrifyingly lethal poisonous ability from the moment he was born. That innate toxin had accidentally taken his mother's life on the birthing table, and later went on to claim the beloved wife he had risked everything to protect. It was precisely because he feared the deadly darkness inside him would spread to his daughter that Cherty chose to push her away in order to keep her safe. But he bitterly realized that his cowardly avoidance had unintentionally given Carmel free rein to torment and crush Roxalyn's spirit. He wept silently inside, looking desperately toward his daughter and realizing she was the only blood bond of love he still had left in this world. Painful memories flooded him one after another, making Cherty scream wordlessly inside as he vowed never again to endure losing someone he loved. The psychological shock became so overwhelming that Cherty completely lost control, his body suddenly releasing clouds of deadly purple poison that filled the entire dining room. The poisonous aura surged in proportion to his rising panic as Cherty became obsessed with one thought: he had to keep his daughter from leaving at any cost. Roxalyn's crimson eyes narrowed in surprise when she unexpectedly witnessed terrifying signs of a poison eruption from her normally composed father. The whole dining room descended into chaos as the red-haired uncle panicked and shouted Cherty's name, ordering him to stop while everyone began coughing violently from inhaling the poison. Roxalyn quickly recognized the sinister aura as her father's innate toxin, but she could not understand why it had suddenly erupted like this. Churdy weakly called his daughter's name through the pain, trying to lift a hand webbed with purple poison veins to signal that she should stay far away from him. The Duke's massive body gave out completely, and he collapsed to his knees, roaring in agony as the poisonous backlash ravaged him. Churdy felt utterly humiliated and powerless, tormenting himself over his cursed ability and hating that Roxalyn had to see him in such a pathetic state. Then he comforted himself with the thought that perhaps this was for the best. If she hated him and willingly stayed away from such a poisonous father, she would remain safe forever. Seeing their niece recklessly charge toward her father while thick poison smoke poured from him, both Ian and the red-haired uncle shouted in panic for her to stop. Roxalyn coldly knocked her uncle's hand aside, ignoring his warnings about the danger and his intention to call people from the Abyss clan to handle it. Roxalyn bluntly criticized everyone's cowardly method of dealing with the problem, saying they only knew how to lock her father away and wait for the poison to settle, instead of going in and solving it properly. Ignoring the hopeless shouts of Ian and the uncle behind her, she kept walking steadily toward her father. Roxalyn lowered her head and sternly ordered her father to relax and suppress the poisonous aura, deliberately using her own life as leverage to threaten him. Churdy's eyes widened and trembled with terror as he forced himself through the tearing pain and used every last ounce of strength to restrain the poison because he refused to hurt his beloved daughter. Looking at her father barely holding on before her, Roxalyn reflected that, from her previous life to this one, this was the first time she had ever stood this close to him. With the lightning-fast mind of someone reborn, Roxalyn suddenly noticed the contradiction. How could a man who possessed a lethal poison ability be harmed by his own toxin? Roxalyn's eyes flashed as she began connecting the clues and uncovered the true nature of her father's strange poison flare-ups. Roxalyn slowly posed a thought-provoking question, trying to pull Churdy out of despair by forcing him to think. Churdy looked up blankly at his daughter's determined face, completely surprised by the suggestive question. While Churdy remained confused and uncertain about what his daughter meant, Roxalyn went ahead and supplied the answer herself based on his self-destructive mindset. Slowly but firmly, Roxalyn delivered the harsh conclusion. His body was breaking down only because he himself had given up the desire to live. Looking deep into her father's exhausted eyes, Roxalyn quietly breathed in relief, because her deduction about the sickness in his heart had been completely correct. She painfully realized that in her previous life, Churdy had died so easily because he was exhausted by a life filled with loss and had come to see his own existence as a curse. Roxalyn openly shared the hurt she had carried for years, admitting that she had always believed her father hated her and regarded her existence as a burden. Churdy's eyes shook violently as tears streamed down his face, and he choked out a denial of the terrible misunderstanding that had strangled his daughter's heart for so many years. Churdy tried to confess his belated love, but before he could finish, Roxalyn leaned in until she was extremely close to him. Seeing the perfect opportunity now that her father's mental defenses had completely collapsed, Roxalyn swiftly uncapped a vial of specially prepared sedative. Without the slightest hesitation, Roxalyn clamped her father's jaw and poured the shimmering blue liquid straight into his mouth, while Churdy stared at her in bewilderment. Churdy only had time to cough violently and ask what on earth his daughter had just forced him to drink before his vision blurred and his consciousness sank into darkness. Supporting her father's body as it went limp, Roxalyn reflected on the special medicine designed for people of the Abyss clan, a drug that should not even exist yet at this point in time. It was the extremely powerful sedative called the Dreamer, which she had recreated early using memories from her previous life so she could intervene before anyone malicious could exploit the situation. Looking at her enormous father, once a terrifying figure, now sleeping peacefully as the poison subsided, Roxalyn smiled in satisfaction at how insanely effective the medicine was. Roxalyn stood, restored the proud bearing of a powerful noblewoman, and ordered the servants to carry the Duke back to his room and clean up the battlefield. Seeing the hem of her dress and her shoes stained and eaten away by the poison, Roxalyn calmly ordered a maid to prepare a new outfit for her immediately. While the maid helped change her shoes, Roxalyn inwardly shuddered with relief, thinking that without the sedative prepared in advance, her legs would probably have melted into liquid by now. Suddenly, the sharp instincts she had developed in her previous life made Roxalyn pause as an uneasy chill told her someone was secretly staring at her. Turning to reassure the three men still frozen in shock that her father would wake soon, Roxalyn inwardly laughed that she had almost forgotten they existed while she was busy saving him. Roxalyn went straight to the point and dropped a completely unexpected statement. The family should hurry up and buy the entire Nolang mine when it went to auction. When the red-haired uncle blankly dismissed the amber mine as worthless, she explained that Marquise Garoon was eyeing it for 1 billion olang, so their family would need to spend around 2.5 billion to guarantee they crushed the competition. Hearing that, Ian burst out laughing and mocked his cousin for apparently losing her mind if she was telling the family to throw money away on some cheap rock mine. Ignoring everyone's objections, she added calmly that the price had hit rock bottom and whether they bought it or not was their choice. When her grandfather finally called her name, Roxalyn responded with perfect politeness, but a distance that felt miles wide. The old man immediately looked hurt and told her to call him grandfather, then sighed and complained that other people's grandchildren sweetly invited their grandfathers shopping, while his own granddaughter was as cold as ice. The young lady immediately poured cold water on him. Those sweet grandchildren were only flattering their grandfathers to dig into the family fortune. So did he really want her to become that kind of person? Faced with his granddaughter's devastatingly sharp comeback, even the powerful Duke could only fall silent and sigh helplessly. Pushing aside the awkwardness, he gently told her that although it might be late, she should speak up about anything troubling her, and he, as her grandfather, would carry the burden with her. He regretfully thought that if she had opened her heart sooner, they could have solved things together, while Roxalyn silently thought that sharing would only make two people exhausted instead of one and solve nothing. Then she casually dropped another announcement. Soon she would be moving into Marquise Garoon's villa in Kaluta so they could handle business more conveniently. Ian immediately jumped up to block her path, warning that Kaluta was a barbaric backwater full of cannibals and that a sheltered noble lady like her would be torn apart over there. Faced with that childish scare tactic, Roxalyn merely curled her lips into a mysterious, confident smile. She sneered at Ian that even little kids no longer believed such ridiculous fairy tales these days. His pride wounded, Ian flushed bright red and stammered bitterly under his cousin's disdainful gaze. The red-haired uncle also tried to stop her from moving out, but Roxalyn brushed him off at once. The Marquise had promised full protection, so there was no point worrying. Her uncle suspiciously shot back, asking why that Marquise was so unusually eager to provide for her and help her this much. Ian immediately jumped in, pointing at her and demanding whether her relationship with that Marquise had already progressed into something seriously questionable. Roxalyn did not even bother dodging the question and simply nodded yes, leaving Ian frozen with his mouth hanging open. She thought to herself that since the two of them had crossed here together from a parallel world, their connection obviously qualified as something special. With that said, Roxalyn elegantly bowed and excused herself, because she still had a mountain of work waiting for her. Ian flushed and rushed after her, shouting that the matter was not finished and she was not allowed to leave. When he started lecturing that a brat like her should not be disrespectful to her elders, Roxalyn grew tired of his persistence and turned to call for her grandfather. Right in front of the Duke, she casually exposed him. His precious second son was a member of Makluksa with the rank of Rook, and the proof was under the sole of his foot, exactly like Carmel's. The revelation struck like lightning from a clear sky, making Ian's eyes bulge in horror as sweat poured down his face after his shocking secret was exposed. Roxalyn smiled triumphantly and leisurely told her grandfather to check for himself if he wanted to be sure. As she walked out the door, she cheerfully wished father and son a warm, memorable bonding experience while verifying the truth. Ian trembled in terror as he felt the murderous chill radiating from his father standing behind him, demanding to know whether the accusation was true. The Duke flew into a rage, cursed his son as useless, and lunged to restrain him, while Ian frantically begged his father to go easy on him. Gripping across tightly, the furious father ground his teeth and warned that Ian had better come up with an extremely convincing explanation for such a grave offense. Elsewhere, at a secret meeting of masked criminals, the leader announced that the 12th bishop had been chained up at the Duke's estate, and that the identity of their useless young master had also been exposed. One subordinate regretted that the bishop had been such a useful piece before getting caught, and that the young master had been obedient too, but there was nothing to do now that both had fallen into the trap. The leader coldly ordered them to eliminate the bishop, to silence the loose end, and continue monitoring the young master, while the subordinate obeyed but remained wary of the Bellion family's formidable defenses. He added that everyone entering or leaving the dungeon carried a soul stone, proving that the other side had already figured out how to counter their ability, making another member ask in surprise what he meant. When the subordinate awkwardly apologized that information had been sealed so tightly they had learned almost nothing, the leader could only click his tongue bitterly. The leader clenched his fist in fury and racked his brain over what the hell had happened to shatter his supposedly perfect plan. The narration emphasized that Bellion territory was the organization's most important link, which was why they had spent so much effort laying traps there for so long. When the leader asked about the other regions, a subordinate quickly reassured him that the remaining noble families were still proceeding smoothly and beautifully according to plan. The leader ordered a full investigation and instructed them to eliminate that useless young master the moment an opportunity appeared, before he could open his mouth and reveal anything damaging. He firmly reminded his followers to take this setback as a painful lesson and burn their ultimate objective into their minds. The narration rang out bitterly, declaring that their mission was to drag those noble people down from heaven into the mud and trample them there. The leader spread his arms and stirred up the crowd, demanding that they be ready to sacrifice themselves for the organization because the day of success was now close at hand. A sinister gleam flashed in his eyes as he promised to turn every mad desire of his followers into reality. Every subordinate bowed deeply at once and shouted their absolute loyalty to the cult leader. In a sunlit garden, Roxalyn read a letter from her father with quiet emotion, as he explained that he had personally chosen every flower and piece of jewelry he sent her with sincere care. Her proud father insisted that Marquise Jeroen could never find anything as fine as these, then used the opportunity to beg her not to go all the way to distant Kaluta. The final line contained his most heartfelt plea. He wanted her to stay by his side forever and never go anywhere. Roxalyn lightly rested a hand on the wooden railing and smiled to herself, thinking that her father had become much more honest lately. Looking out at nature, she reflected that after opening her heart just once, things had improved this much, and wondered whether her previous life might have turned out differently if she had been brave enough to speak up. She remembered that in her previous life, once she learned that enduring quietly got her nowhere, whenever she lost her temper, she would grab an enemy by the hair or slap them straight across the face without showing mercy. Her motto had been that anyone who wronged her deserved 10,000 times the retaliation, and part of her reckless attitude came from believing that neither her father nor anyone in the family cared about her. She bitterly realized that the only way she knew to protect her wounded pride back then was to turn herself into a rebellious troublemaker in everyone's eyes. But the price she paid for those reckless years had been brutally high. Filthy rumors had spread throughout high society, invented by people who hated her and wanted to drag her reputation into the gutter. When she finally could not withstand the pressure and ran away from home, those persistent enemies began using increasingly vicious methods to take revenge on her. She ended up dirt poor because no one would hire her, forcing her to dig up the secrets of enemy families and sell the information just to scrape together enough money to survive from meal to meal. At the same time, she used those powers as tools to carry out bloody purges against the people who had once harmed her. To gather intelligence, she became ruthless enough to exploit and discard anyone like a disposable pawn. During one desperate escape, even after the kind people of a small town sheltered her, she coldly abandoned them to be massacred by royal troops so she could escape alone. Even knowing in advance the terrible fate awaiting her benefactors, she closed her eyes to it because her desire to survive was too strong. At that time, staying alive one more day mattered above everything else. Yet that belated guilt still rose from time to time and tore at her heart, even after she had been granted this second chance at life. She wondered whether her first life might have been less painful if she had lowered her pride and asked her family for help and affection. Perhaps then she might have received a gentler ending instead of dying alone and full of resentment. But she immediately dismissed the thought, telling herself that such pointless what-ifs had no value anymore. Mocking herself for this sudden sentimentality that did not suit her at all, she pulled herself together and focused on the difficult challenges ahead. She sorted through the pile of invitations and noticed that aside from a few minor tea parties, one letter had come directly from the palace. She understood that even though her engagement to the crown prince had been cancelled, she still had to attend this event to show that House Bellion remained aligned with the royal family. She decided that for now she would write letters declining every other invitation, then paused when she picked up the final, particularly unusual envelope. Roxalyn exclaimed in surprise when she recognized Crown Prince Arma's familiar handwriting, carefully sealed with blue wax. Crown Prince Arma's letter politely asked permission to visit the Bellion estate because he had prepared a gift and had several important matters he wished to discuss with her in person. The Crown Prince said he hoped to spend some time with her, while Roxalyn's eyes remained cold as ice as she read the words. She thought that he was always so painfully proper and courteous that rejecting him outright almost made her feel guilty, while guessing that his real reason for visiting was surely to make her reconsider ending the engagement. She made up her mind immediately. It would be better to meet at the upcoming royal ball, because meeting privately now would accomplish nothing, so she should refuse him at once. Opening the last letter, Roxalyn quietly read the resentful complaint that she had treated the sender far too cruelly. After reading it, the young lady could only laugh in delight at the sender's helpless frustration. She casually tore Marquis Geroon's letter to pieces, smugly thinking that he must have received the painful news that he had lost the auction for the Nolang mine. Dropping the scraps onto the table, she sent Geroon a fake apology in her thoughts, and smugly noted that in this game, whoever obtained information first was the one who took the prize. She smiled in satisfaction because everything remained under control, only to jump at the sudden rapid knocking from outside. A timid maid entered and reported that the Duke urgently wanted to see her, making Roxalyn raise an eyebrow and ask again to make sure. Immediately guessing that her grandfather had discovered the secret hidden beneath that cheap amber mine, she calmly nodded and said she would go see him right away. Walking along the red-carpeted hallway, she suddenly remembered that someone closely connected to that mine in her previous life would definitely appear at the upcoming royal ball. At first she had been certain the man's name was Gilbert, but then the image of the rough man drawing his sword and loudly declaring himself Baron Robert flashed into her mind and corrected her memory. Remembering the Baron's arrogant insult that she should kneel and thank him for lowering himself enough to propose marriage, Roxalyn felt contempt as she realized she would soon meet the entire family of that fat pig who had harassed her years ago. A wicked, excited smile spread across her face as she thought that the upcoming ball was going to be extremely dramatic and lively. Entering the study, Roxalyn politely greeted her grandfather good afternoon, and the old man, sipping red wine, cheerfully told her to sit down and talk. He went straight to the matter of the Nolang mine, admitting that thanks to her advice, he had successfully won the bid by a landslide. But the old man gave a knowing smirk and revealed new intelligence he had received. The actual mineral in that mine was not cheap amber as everyone believed. He emphasized how strange this was because the truth was top secret, and no one should have known in advance, then stared at her and asked how she had obtained information accurate enough to advise him. Her grandfather narrowed his eyes in scrutiny and suddenly lowered his voice to ask his granddaughter a pointed question. Looking directly at her, he asked whether she had awakened and become one of the legendary Abyss beings. Roxalyn did not flinch in the slightest, and simply smiled calmly as she admitted it to the Duke. Of course, inwardly she thought that she merely knew the future from a parallel world, but explaining the complicated reincarnation story would be too troublesome, so it was easier to let him misunderstand. The old man took a drag from his cigarette and nodded thoughtfully, accepting her short answer. The narration blended into the Duke's memories. He had once thought she did not resemble her gentle mother at all, but now that she had grown, those sharp eyes perfectly reflected his daughter-in-law, the one strong woman who had courageously protected the lonely Cherty. Tragically, that poor mother lost her life because of the hereditary poison in Cherty's blood when she stubbornly refused to take the antidote out of fear it would harm the child inside her. Although Cherty desperately researched day and night for a new antidote that would be safer, time waited for no one, and his beloved wife passed away forever, shortly after giving birth to Roxalyn. The narration grew emotional as it explained that Roxalyn had been born terribly frail, becoming the greatest pain and fear of Cherty's life as he frantically held his feverish, convulsing newborn daughter and screamed for someone to bring her temperature down. Haunted by the fact that his own poison had caused his wife's death, the poor father lived in constant terror that his daughter would leave him in the same painful way. The trauma destabilized Cherty more and more. He protected Roxalyn like a glass flower inside a case, distrusted everyone, and did not even dare approach or hold his own child because he feared his poison might hurt her. Time passed in a hopeless stalemate because no one in the estate knew how to care for her or make up for the missing affection, causing Roxalyn to grow increasingly timid, withdrawn, and silent, somehow even more so than her eccentric father. Whenever the Duke tried to start a reconciliation, Lady Roxalyn would nearly faint, her face turning deathly pale before she ran away at full speed. That left the Duke completely helpless, making excuses that he should not upset her and then sighing repeatedly while blaming himself. But after narrowly missing her ticket to the afterlife, Roxalyn had completely transformed into an entirely different person. The Duke reassured himself that a major trauma could naturally change someone's personality, but a full 180-degree turn like this felt almost like a spiritual awakening. Warm on the outside but ice-cold within, he thought that she had now become indifferent, brutally direct, and so harsh that she seemed to have no affection left at all. She claimed to have awakened a new ability, then stubbornly spread her wings and demanded to fly straight out of this suffocating birdcage. The old man felt heartbroken watching his granddaughter insist on throwing herself into the cruel world outside and abandoning the peaceful garden he had spent his whole life carefully tending. That was unacceptable to him, so he needed to correct it immediately. From now on, she was forbidden from calling him the distant Duke and had to call him grandfather as instructed. Roxalyn gently explained that she had thought addressing him so familiarly would offend him, making the old man stare at her in confusion and ask why on earth it would. She casually dropped the blunt answer. After all, she was not a true member of the Bellion family, merely an illegitimate child. Her grandfather laughed and insisted that Bellion blood flowed through her regardless, while inwardly cursing his son Cherty for being so foolish that he still had not told her the truth. Then he decided to put an end to the lies and admitted that he had ignored the matter all this time because he trusted Cherty's promise to handle it himself, never imagining things would turn out like this. The Duke firmly declared that Roxalyn was absolutely not an illegitimate child, leaving her frozen for a full 5 seconds in complete shock. When she confusedly demanded how that could be possible when her name was plainly listed among the illegitimate children, he insisted that she had been properly registered in the lawful family genealogy. He stated it with absolute certainty. She was his one and only granddaughter and the legitimate daughter of Cherty Bellion. Having finished untangling that issue, he tapped ash into the tray and told her to go deal with her father herself. Sitting alone in the chair afterward, Roxalin's thoughts were a complete mess, because right up until the moment she died in her previous life, she had never once doubted the label of illegitimate child. Letting out a breath, she finally realized that all this bitter family drama had apparently started from her father's impossible attitude. But thinking back, she wondered whether her father had ever actually called her illegitimate himself, or whether she had created the entire drama in her own mind. She bitterly realized that this huge misunderstanding had grown from the family's difficult circumstances and the defensive shell she herself had built to avoid getting hurt. As she descended the stone steps, her grandfather's voice still echoed in her ears, admitting that he had never been the kind of person who knew how to say sweet things. He had told her that when she foolishly tried to take her own life, her father had been frantic with worry and unable to sit still for even a moment. At the time, his youngest son had completely lost it and thrown the entire estate into chaos because he was terrified for his daughter's life. Her grandfather explained that because Cherty had been raised under the harsh training of a stubborn man like himself, he had no idea how to express affection. His words might be rough, but he had never hated her for even a single second. The Duke guaranteed that truth to his granddaughter on his own noble honor. He blamed himself for spending too much time fighting the storms outside and neglecting the home, never realizing how the roses in his own garden were growing. With the Duke himself backing her up, Roxalin decided to go see her father immediately and settle all this nonsense once and for all. She knocked on her father's door, determined to clear up every pointless misunderstanding that had built up over the years. But her polite knock was answered by a furious shout from inside, telling her to go away and stop bothering him. Cherty, his hair sticking out like a bird's nest and a test tube of poison in hand, roared a threat. Did whoever was knocking want to get poisoned to death by coming here? When the person outside stubbornly kept knocking, he snapped, spun around, and prepared to unleash an unforgettable verbal beating. He yanked the door open while angrily demanding what stubborn idiot dared underestimate his poison. But the curses jammed in his throat the moment he realized the person standing there was his daughter Roxalin. Cherty's mouth fell open as he awkwardly stammered, asking why she had suddenly appeared in a place like this. Cherty hurriedly raised his voice to hide his concern, insisting that she was absolutely forbidden from coming anywhere near such a dangerous place. Hearing her father grumble that it would be a huge headache if she got sick again, Roxalin immediately called him out. Was he worried that the toxic air here would harm the frail body she had had since childhood? Caught perfectly, her father flushed in embarrassment and froze for several seconds after his daughter saw straight through his whole cold on the outside, soft on the inside act. Roxalin calmly said that all this time she had assumed he drove her away because he hated her, making Cherty frantically wave his hands and explain that he had only spoken without thinking. Cherty cursed himself inwardly for being so terrible with words and unable to say anything properly, finally realizing why he had spent all these years communicating with his daughter almost entirely through letters. He painfully admitted to himself that whenever he got nervous, his defense mechanism kicked in, and everything that came out of his mouth turned sharp, while the number of times he genuinely interacted with other human beings could be counted on one hand. Suddenly having to face his daughter directly made him panic that his clumsy way of speaking would once again hurt Roxalin without meaning to. Seeing her father standing there frozen like a statue, the young lady quietly asked whether he planned to make her stand outside the door like a roadside marker forever, snapping him out of his daze. When his daughter coughed and complained that the stuffy air was irritating her nose, Cherty hurriedly explained that the residue from his poison had not fully dispersed yet. He quickly urged her to wait upstairs while he brought the antidote to her, but she stubbornly refused and insisted that she preferred staying here. Cherty panicked and suggested that she at least sit in the neighboring reception room where the air would be less toxic. Then he abruptly stopped, remembering that the room had not been cleaned at all and currently looked more like a chaotic medicine storage room after a battle. He mentally checked the dining room and the ominous training room too, but every space was far too gloomy, and none felt worthy of receiving his precious Roxalin. Seeing her father flustered beyond belief, she casually threatened to go home if he did not want her there, making Cherty frantically shake his head in denial. He hurriedly invited her inside but begged for just a few minutes to clean up the mess first. Roxalyn had no patience to wait, so she simply walked straight in and added, "It really is dirty in here," while her father stood there clutching stacks of papers and looking miserable as he tried to tidy up. He awkwardly told her to sit wherever she could find a spot, then immediately handed her a bottle of golden antidote and ordered her to drink it. As he clumsily brewed tea and defensively warned that it might not taste good, the sight of her busy father made Roxalyn feel unexpectedly warm inside and realize that her grandfather had been completely right. Knowing that asking about her identity right now would probably get nothing coherent out of her father, she decided to change direction and discuss the important matter first. She asked whether her father had ever attended any balls before, making his hands freeze halfway through lifting the teacup. Her father stared at her in baffled suspicion and repeated the word ball, bringing their slightly awkward, yet deeply affectionate conversation to a close.